Hi, and welcome to Sleepy History. If you're listening to this at night, I hope it helps you unwind. Please like and subscribe, it means so much to me. Where in the world are you watching from and what time is it? It's so nice to think that wherever we are, we're sharing this moment together. Tonight's story begins not in a castle or cathedral, but in a simple field. The hour is early. The mist still clings to the earth, soft and silver, and the trees stand hushed along the edges of a narrow path. Somewhere nearby, a stream babbles gently over smooth stones, its voice the only sound in the quiet morning. A small cottage rests near the edge of the field. Its roof is made of thatch, its walls of wattle and daub, patched over the years by careful, calloused hands. Smoke curls from a narrow chimney, drifting upward in a lazy spiral before dissolving into the sky. The door stands slightly ajar, letting in the scent of damp earth and wild thyme. Inside, the floor is hard-packed dirt, swept clean. A fire crackles softly in the hearth, and the air is warm with the smell of porridge cooking over the embers. A wooden bench runs along the wall, beside a narrow bed stuffed with straw. On a low shelf, a clay cup and a wooden spoon rest beside a crust of bread. It is a humble space, but it is home. The peasant family that lives here begins their day not with leisure, but with rhythm. The kind passed down through generations, rise with the sun, tend the animals, work the soil, rest only when darkness falls. Each task is as familiar as breath. The father, already dressed, lifts a small bucket from beside the door. His tunic is patched, his boots worn from many seasons. He steps outside without a word, heading toward the shed where the cow must be milked before the sun climbs too high. His movements are slow, deliberate, shaped by years of repetition. Behind him, his wife stirs the porridge. She moves with care, not rushing. Her hands are red from washing, her apron dusted with flour. A child still sleeps in the corner, wrapped in a wool blanket, their breaths soft and even. Outside, the village is beginning to wake. Crows call from the trees. A cart rattles softly along the muddy path, its wheels catching in the ruts from yesterday's rain. In the distance, church bells chime faintly, their sound carried on the wind. It is a signal, a beginning. Life for a medieval peasant is shaped by duty, by seasons, by the rising and setting of the sun. But it is also shaped by patience. Nothing happens quickly. Each day unfolds like a page in a quiet book. Even hardship arrives softly, woven into the hours like straw into a basket. In the field beyond the cottage, rows of vegetables stretch out in damp earth. Cabbage, leeks, turnips, all planted by hand, tended with care. There are no tools but those made of wood and iron. No beasts of burden but one old ox, slow but steady. The land offers its gifts, but only when asked politely and never without effort. There is no clock here. Time is marked by the light, by the call of birds, by the ache in the back at midday. Meals are simple: bread, onions, beans, a bit of cheese if the cow is generous, a bit of ale if the barley harvest was kind. And yet, in the stillness, there is beauty. The soft green of moss along the cottage wall, the sparkle of dew on a spider's web, the quiet companionship of chickens scratching near the doorstep. The day has only just begun, but already the rhythm is in motion. A rhythm older than any one life. A rhythm that carries peasants through toil and hunger, through cold winters and short summers. It is not an easy life, but it is one that hums with its own kind of peace, its own kind of sleep-soft steadiness. And as the sun climbs higher, casting warm light across the fields and rooftops, the village stirs fully into life, gentle, and slow. The morning deepened, and with it came the slow unfolding of duty. The village, nestled between low hills and bordered by narrow woods, stirred in measured silence. Smoke rose from more chimneys now, thin and pale, carrying the scents of ash, grain, and yesterday's fire. Down the muddy lane, peasants moved with quiet purpose. Their footsteps were heavy, not from haste, but from knowing exactly where they needed to go. Fields awaited. So did the Lord's grain. There was always more to do than could be done. Near the manor, set on a low rise above the village, the steward watched from beneath the shade of a stone archway. His face was lined, his tunic neater than most, though still plain. In his hands he held a narrow roll of parchment, a list perhaps, a tally, a memory of obligation. The peasants knew their place on that parchment without needing to see it. Their work did not begin with their own small garden plots, nor with their own barley or sheep. First came the land that belonged to the Lord, the strips of field closest to the manor, the wheat that must be sown and harvested, the oxen that must be shared. This was the cost of living beneath the protection of stone walls and a banner fluttering in the wind. A boy of 13 guided a wooden plough drawn by a tired ox. His hands were raw, his eyes quiet. Beside him, his older brother scattered seed from a wicker basket. The soil was damp and sticky. Their feet sank with each step. Farther down the field, a group of women stooped in the furrows, pulling weeds and setting traps for beetles. Their headscarves fluttered in the breeze. One of them sang softly, a tune more breath than melody, not to cheer, just to mark the time. Each field was divided into narrow strips, belonging to different families but worked together. There was no solitude in the peasants' toil, only togetherness, shared aches, shared rain, shared bread at dusk. The manor itself loomed at the top of the hill, not large, not grand, but sturdier than the cottages below. Its roof was of slate, its windows of oiled linen or glass, where glass was rare. Flags hung from its corners, their colours muted by weather. The Lord seldom appeared in the fields, though sometimes his steward walked among the workers, noting tools that needed repair or reminding them of the tithe. Taxes were not gold coins or silver, they were labour, days given to another man's harvest. Portions of bread, baskets of eggs, a pig at Christmas, a hen on the feast of St. Martin, and there was the church too. At the edge of the field, the village priest passed by, his robes dusty, a book clutched close to his chest. He offered a nod to the workers, who dipped their heads in return. The church was both comfort and obligation. Prayers were offered for a good harvest. But the church too took its share. By midday, the sun stood high, and the heat softened the earth. The workers paused, not to rest, but to stretch their backs. A few sat on stones at the edge of the path, chewing crusts of bread. Water passed from one cracked flask to another. No one spoke much. A woman reached into her pouch and pulled out a tiny carved charm, a gift from her father, or maybe her child. She rubbed it between her fingers as she gazed out across the field. The earth was vast and brown. Her patch, just a piece of it. And still, the work went on. The ox pulled, the soil turned, the seed scattered, the weeds burned in little piles by the path, each action small, each moment part of something older, larger, heavier than any one soul could name. And above it all, the manor stood, watching, waiting, not cruel perhaps, but unmoving, a stone presence beneath the sky. And so the peasants returned to their furrows, to the dirt beneath their nails and the ache behind their eyes. The land did not belong to them. but it was theirs to carry, day by slow day, into the fading light. As the sun drifted westward, its golden light fell gently across the rooftops and the fields. Shadows lengthened, stretching along the furrows, slipping beneath carts and leaning over fences. A breeze passed softly through the wheat, brushing the stalks until they whispered. The villagers, tired and sore, made their way home. The cottages were small and low, their roofs thick with thatch and the smell of smoke. Stone walls, rough and mossy, held back the earth outside, though not entirely. Damp crept in at the corners and cold in winter, but for now the day's warmth still clung to the walls. Inside, the hearth was always the heart of the home. A few glowing coals waited under grey ash. With practiced hands, a woman coaxed them back to life, adding twigs, then kindling, then a thick piece of wood. The flames caught slowly, spreading orange light across the dirt floor and wooden bench. Dinner would be no feast. It rarely was. A pot of barley bubbled gently over the fire, thickened with onions, leeks, and whatever herbs the garden had offered. Some nights there was cheese, often only bread, coarse and brown, made from rye and ground with grit that wore down teeth over the years. A thin broth might stretch across several bowls. A crust of bread dipped into it, passed from hand to hand, then eaten slowly, silently. Children sat on low stools, their feet muddy, their eyes heavy. Their parents watched them eat, not smiling, but content in a quiet way. If a hen had laid an egg, it might be shared, split in two or stirred into the pot. If an apple had been picked from the edge of the woods, it would be sliced thinly and given to the smallest child. There were no spoons for everyone. Some used hands, others a shared ladle. No plates, only bowls or bits of cloth. But there was warmth, and a roof, and the breath of family filling the room in slow unison. The cat, curled by the hearth, opened one eye as a piece of crust fell to the floor. It stretched, blinked, then settled again, its purring a soft hum against the crackle of flame. There was little talk. The day had taken most of their words, but sometimes a story was told, a simple one, of a fox near the woodpile or a dream from the night before. The words hung in the air like smoke, slow and curling, then disappeared into the shadows. After the meal, the bowls were rinsed with water from the well, just a little. Each drop mattered. The fire was banked for the night, its heat preserved beneath layers of ash. Clothes were hung near the wall to dry. Tools were set by the door. A loaf of bread was wrapped in cloth and placed beneath a bench where the mice couldn't reach it easily. One by one they lay down, some on straw mattresses, some on old cloaks, some curled together, sharing warmth. The floor was hard, but they were used to it. Sleep came quickly, the kind that arrives not in silence, but in the steady breath of those who have labored long. Outside, the stars rose, scattered across the sky like spilled flour. The fields were quiet now, the paths empty, the cottages still. Only the soft sound of an owl somewhere in the distance broke the hush. And in that small space of warmth and weariness, the peasants slept. Full enough, safe enough. The day behind them, the next already waiting. The night passed quietly, as most nights did in the village. A light breeze slipped through the cracks in the walls, brushing against the straw mats and the folded cloaks that served as bedding. Outside, the moon drifted overhead, and the cottages sat like stones under its silver gaze. But in one home, the hush was broken by the sound of coughing. It was the dry, aching cough of a child, not loud, but persistent. the kind that woke parents from the edge of sleep, pulling them upright in the dark. The fire had long since faded and the room was cold. The mother rose without a word, moving by feel rather than light. She reached for a damp cloth and pressed it to the child's brow. The warmth there was worrying. The boy's cheeks were flushed, his breath shallow. She sat beside him, humming quietly. Not a lullaby, not any more. Just a note to calm herself as much as him. There was no doctor, no medicine, not truly. Only what could be made from herbs and hope. At dawn, as the mist lifted from the fields, the mother wrapped her shawl tight around her shoulders and stepped outside. The ground was damp, her feet quickly chilled. She made her way along the narrow lane, past closed shutters and stacked firewood, until she reached the last cottage at the edge of the trees. The healer lived alone. She was old, though no one knew how old exactly. Her hair was long and grey, her hands twisted from years of work, but her eyes were clear and sharp. She greeted the mother with a quiet nod, listened to the tale of the fever, and without question began to gather things. From shelves and baskets she drew sprigs of thyme, dried nettle, crushed bark, and a small twist of cloth filled with wild garlic. She handed them over with instructions spoken softly, shaped by seasons of knowing. Steep these, lay the cloth on his chest, keep him warm, keep the air still. The mother offered what she could in return, a bit of bread, a wooden bead, a blessing whispered from her heart. The healer accepted it all with the same gentle nod. Back in the cottage, the herbs were set to steep in the smallest of pots. Steam rose, filling the room with sharp, earthy scents. The boy stirred, eyes half open, and the mother sat beside him once more, coaxing him to drink. There was no certainty, no promise. Some fevers passed, others did not. In a village without doctors, illness was not an event, but a companion. It came with the cold, with the damp, with the breath of strangers or the bite of fleas. It settled into bones and lingered in corners. And always, it reminded everyone just how thin the line was between strength and stillness. The father returned from the fields at dusk, his boots heavy with mud. He stepped inside, saw the boy wrapped in blankets, and knelt without speaking. He laid a calloused hand on the child's head and closed his eyes, not in prayer, just for a moment, just to feel. Outside, the sky darkened. A candle was lit. The scent of garlic and nettle still hung in the air. The hearth gave off a faint warmth, and the boy's breathing slowed. There was nothing more to do but wait. And so they did, through the night, through the silence, through the hours marked not by bells or clocks, but by each slow breath that followed the last. The sky was grey when morning came, not with storm, but with the quiet weight of the season turning. The kind of grey that dimmed even the brightest of fields and made every sound softer. A chill had settled into the earth. The breeze carried it through the village, along the thatched roofs, between the stone walls, and under every door. Winter was near. In the fields, little remained. The last of the turnips had been pulled, their tops wilted and soil-caked. The barley had been cut and threshed weeks before. Now the land lay bare, waiting under the sky. Its rows were furrowed and stubbled, resting after months of labour. Peasants moved more slowly now, shoulders wrapped in wool, feet heavier on the frost-kissed paths. Voices were fewer. Chores still called, but they were briefer, colder, and shaped by the shortening light. Inside the cottages, smoke began to rise again from every hearth. Fires were kept low during the day to save wood, but their warmth was tended with quiet reverence. Each log, each stick of kindling, was a gift not easily gathered. Food was rationed with care. Bread, hard and dark, was softened in broth. Onions were strung along beams to keep them dry. Beans and dried peas filled cloth sacks, nestled beside clay pots of lard and tallow. Apples had been buried in straw to keep them through the weeks ahead. Every item was counted, every portion measured. In one cottage, a woman sorted lentils by hand, spreading them across the table and picking out the stones. Her fingers moved slowly, methodically, as the wind whispered at the door. Her daughter watched, a piece of cloth, half embroidered, resting in her lap. Neither spoke. There was no need. The healer made her way through the village, checking on the sick, sharing herbs, mending cloth, and nodding her thanks for every cup of warm drink offered. She moved with the ease of someone who knew the quiet fears that winter brought. Her basket was never empty for long. Children played less now. They stayed near the fire, their breath visible even indoors. A boy drew pictures in the ash beside the hearth with a stick. A girl pressed her ear to a cup and whispered secrets, pretending it carried them to the next room. At the edge of the village, the church bell rang, not for prayer, but to mark the week's end. Its tone was low and clear, echoing across the thatched roofs and into the forest beyond. People lifted their heads when it sounded, paused in their tasks, and then returned to their work with slower hands. Winter did not announce itself with a storm. It arrived in pauses, in shorter afternoons, in the ache of joints, in the way fingers moved more carefully in the morning, in the silence that stretched between footsteps. The tavern still opened each evening, but fewer came. Most chose warmth over ale, blankets over benches. For those who did gather, it was for quiet companionship, a shared fire, a bowl of stew, a few soft words about the cold or the woodpile, or the sound of the wind in the thatch. And above all, the season asked for patience. Patience to wait for spring. Patience to share what little remained. Patience to endure the long nights, the deep frost, the stillness that crept through even the thickest walls. And so the village held its breath. Wrapped in wool, fed by roots, guided by habit. Waiting, always waiting for the warmth to return. The days passed with quiet repetition. The wind shifted slightly each morning, coming colder from the north. The fields had long since emptied, and now they sat beneath a thin crust of frost, brittle and pale beneath a faded sky. Life, for the peasant, did not slow with the season, it only changed shape. The land did not belong to them. This truth sat heavily in their bones, spoken not in words, but in rules carved into the rhythm of their lives. The cottages, the strips of field, the forest paths, they were all part of the Lord's estate. Even the trees, gnarled and bare in the winter wind, could not be felled without permission. A peasant might gather fallen branches, nothing more. In the manor's stone hall, papers marked boundaries. Boundaries shaped lives. A man might spend his whole life tilling the same earth, raising children in the same narrow bed, yet own not a single patch of ground. His labour paid rent, his bread paid dues, his back bent to meet the expectations of those who lived under roof tiles instead of thatch. Bound by custom and oath, a peasant could not leave the manor's land without permission. The paths beyond the village, those that curved into the trees or stretched toward distant hills, were not meant for wandering. To leave was to risk the loss of home, of protection, of food when the stores ran low. Even marriage was part of this order. A woman who wed a man from another manor owed a fee. So did the man if he took his bride beyond his lord's fields. The steward recorded these things, quietly, precisely. Each name, Each transfer, each small shift in the fabric of the village. And so people stayed. Their roots dug deep into the soil, as fixed as the stones in their cottage walls. Not because they lacked the will to go, but because they knew the cost. To leave one's land was to walk away from the only rhythm ever known. Still, not all was hardship. In winter's stillness, there was time for craft. Men carved handles for tools, patched old buckets, mended wheels. Women spun wool, wove cloth, and brewed tinctures from herbs dried in the summer sun. Children learned by watching, by copying, by being folded into work like flour into bread. Stories were told too. Near the fire, when the last of the light had faded and the frost thickened outside the door, voices would rise in gentle murmur. Tales of beasts in the woods, of nights long gone, of saints who slept beneath rivers and appeared only in dreams. The stories helped, so did the work. Together, they stitched meaning into the long grey hours. And in all of it, the mending, the labour, the telling, there was the land. Always the land. It gave just enough to survive. No more. It held their breath in its cold furrows. It waited for their return each morning. They did not own it, but it owned them. Above the village, on a low rise of earth and stone, the manor stood. Not grand like a castle, not vast like a palace, but tall enough to look down over the thatched roofs below. Its wooden beams and stone base weathered the years with the quiet patience of those who had never needed to hurry. The lord who lived within its walls rarely descended to the village. His presence was felt more than seen, in the tolls paid, the tasks assigned, the permissions requested and denied. His steward walked the paths in his name, his seal pressed into the wax of every message, his orders spoken through others' mouths. Yet the people knew him. They knew the colour of his banner, the sound of his horses' hooves on the frozen road, the way the wind shifted slightly when his hunting party passed through the woods. His world was one of falcons and feasts, of fine goblets and letters written by candlelight. And yet, his hands did not touch the earth. The peasants' hands did, calloused, cracked, red from frost and work. The harvest that filled the Lord's granary passed first through the palms of those who would never taste its richness. The geese in his kitchens had been fattened in peasant yards. The eggs, the milk, the wool, all gathered beneath his shadow. Sometimes he gave back. On feast days, a bit of coin might trickle down, or a small gift. Cloth dyed in muted hues, a cured ham, a cask of ale. There were celebrations, toasts made in the Lord's name, songs sung in the cool air outside the church. But even in generosity, the order remained. The Lord above, the village below. Inside the manor, the air was different, warmer, scented with spices brought from far places. Light came not from open shutters, but from glass. Real glass, wavy and clear, that caught the sun and cast it gently across tapestries and carved wood. The Lord's meals were served on plates of pewter, his bread white and soft. His nights lit by tallow candles, set in tall holders of brass. He had his duties too, his allegiance to greater lords, to the church, to the crown. But these were distant burdens. When war threatened, the call went out. When taxes were demanded, coin was sent. And when law was broken, he heard the case, seated high above the gathered crowd, his steward by his side. A peasant who stole could lose more than bread. A peasant who fled might lose all. Still, there were moments of quiet between. Moments when the Lord passed along the village road and nodded to a passing child. When he watched a dance during harvest time, and allowed a faint smile to touch his face. When he heard a song echo from the tavern window and paused just for a heartbeat to listen. He did not speak their language, not truly, but his shadow lay across the fields, across the smoke curling from every chimney, across the dreams of those who worked the land, not cruel, not kind, simply there. And so the peasants laboured beneath that shadow, quietly, daily, without revolt, without praise, because the fields would not wait, because the winter would return, because in every handful of soil there was both burden and breath. Life in the village did not offer much in the way of change. One day bled into the next, marked only by the weather, the harvest, and the weight of the sky. But every so often, something softer broke through. A pause, a feast day, a moment when labour loosened its grip and the village breathed differently. Holy days came with the rhythm of the church. The calendar was not measured in months and years, but in saints and seasons, Candlemas, Michaelmas, the feast of St. Andrew, the Nativity. Each brought its own customs, its own prayers, and more importantly for the peasants, its own rest. On these days, the tools were set down, the ploughs left in the shed, the bread baked a little richer. Even the Lord, from his place above, recognized the sacred order. On feast days, he might open his stores. He might walk among the people and share a word, a gift, a nod. The church bells rang early on those mornings, low and slow, calling the villagers not to work, but to worship. They gathered in the small chapel at the village's edge, cloaked in wool, their breath visible in the chill. The priest, robed in humble linen, led them in prayer. The Latin words flowed above their heads, ancient and unknowable, yet familiar in rhythm. Afterwards, a stillness fell, then slowly, carefully, the joy emerged. Children skipped stones near the frozen brook. Women exchanged herbs and stories. Men shared mugs of ale, laughter rising like smoke into the grey sky. A fiddler might appear, carving melody from silence, drawing feet into slow, shuffling dances. Even the poorest found something to offer. A bit of honey, a few dried apples, a ribbon once bright now faded from sun and time. These gifts, humble and heartfelt, passed between hands with warmth. The tavern swelled with gentle noise, not loud, not unruly, just the murmur of release. A hearth full of light, a table set with bread and broth, a corner filled with song. The ale was not strong, but it was shared freely. The fire popped and crackled. A tale was told of foxes that spoke, of saints who healed, of kings who once walked the very path outside. Even the animals felt it. The oxen rested in their stalls. The chickens wandered freely, scratching in the straw. The cat curled in a patch of sun by the tavern door, blinking slowly at every passer-by. For one day, hunger loosened its grip. For one day, the burden eased. Laughter returned to lips that had grown quiet with frost. Hands that sowed and reaped and mended turned instead to music, to touch, to the gentle act of holding a warm cup. And though the sun set early, as it always did in winter, the glow from the windows lingered. Candles burned later. Shadows danced on the walls. The fire was fed one extra log, just this once. No one spoke of the next day's labour, not yet. For now there was warmth. For now there was peace. And in the hush that settled after the last song ended and the last ember glowed, the village slept, wrapped not in comfort, but in something just as dear. Small, brief joy, held close like a secret. By midwinter the stores began to thin. The The cellars, once lined with jars and sacks, looked emptier now. The air inside them was cold and dry. Each step down into their depths brought a hush, a kind of listening, to the silence of what had already been eaten, and the quiet warning of what might not last. Hunger did not come all at once. It crept in, quiet and careful. First, the portions shrank. Bowls were filled less fully. Bread was sliced thinner. Onions were stretched across 2 meals instead of 1. Then came the substitutions. Barley where oats had been. Weeds boiled to soften their bitterness. A broth made from bones already used once before. The peasants knew the rhythm of scarcity. It was not a surprise. It was simply another season to endure. Children grew quieter, not from scolding, but from the slow fatigue of not quite enough. Their play lost its wildness. They sat near the hearth longer, watching the flames instead of chasing the chickens. A mother might sing to distract them as the pot boiled, though there was less and less to stir inside. The ox grew thinner, ribs beginning to show beneath its winter coat. It was fed what could be spared: frozen straw, bruised apples, the last of the husks. It still worked, still pulled, but more slowly now. It too understood endurance. In the manor above, the stores were fuller, not overflowing, but sufficient. The steward made sure of that. Salted meat, dried fruit, wheels of cheese wrapped in cloth. Enough to see the household through the freeze. The Lord did not go hungry, nor did the priest. The church kept its share as surely as the land held its frost. The peasants did not speak of fairness, not often, not aloud. They spoke instead of hope, of spring, of the first green shoots, of the rain that would come to soften the soil, of the lambs yet to be born. They remembered other years, some worse, some better. They told stories of great freezes and miraculous thaws. At night, the dreams changed. No longer full of saints and travellers, they turned to tables, loaves of warm bread, sweet milk, bowls filled to the brim. Even in sleep, the body remembered. It asked, gently, for more. And still, they worked. Each day brought tasks: wood to split, tools to mend, snares to check at the edge of the woods. Even the coldest day held moments that must be filled, lest the silence grow too large. One morning, a boy found a bird fallen in the snow. He cupped it in his hands, breath visible in the air, and ran home with careful steps. It would not be eaten, not yet. It would be warmed, federal, watched. A reminder that not all things needed to be taken. Later that night, a neighbour shared a crust of honeycomb, thin and brittle but still sweet. The children closed their eyes as they tasted it, letting it melt slowly on their tongues. And in that hush, beneath the thatched roofs and the frost-laced beams, hunger stayed, but so did kindness. They coexisted, like frost and fire, like silence and song. Winter, though harsh, was not idle. The fields might sleep, but the hands of the peasants never did. When the earth grew too hard to till, and the roads too slick with frost to travel far, the work turned inward, into the home, into the hearth, into the slow, rhythmic craft that filled the hours between dawn and dusk. The cottage became a workshop. Near the fire, the spinning wheel creaked softly, its spindle humming with each careful motion. Wool, washed and carded, was fed through nimble fingers, drawn into thread as fine as breath. The spinner, often the grandmother, the aunt, the eldest daughter, worked by feel as much as sight. Her hands knew the tug, the tension, the moment when the fibres must twist. Beside her, the loom stood near the wall, its frame large and simple, its wood burnished by years of use. Strips of woven wool hung across its frame, plain and brown, sometimes dyed with nettle or walnut shell, rarely more than 2 colours. But the care with which it was woven gave the cloth its meaning. A new blanket for a child, a shawl to replace the one worn through at the shoulders, strips of fabric for mending tunics, wrapping feet, padding cloaks. The children watched, sometimes helping. They wound thread onto bobbins, fetched more wool from the sack in the corner, sang softly to match the rhythm of the wheel. It was not a loud rhythm, just the soft thump of the treadle, the whisper of wool sliding through hands. Men worked leather by the window, where the light fell most steadily, patching shoes, stitching bags, shaping belts from scraps of hide cured long ago in smoke and ash. Their knives were sharp, their hands thick and careful. Every piece mattered. Nothing was wasted. Old tools were oiled and sharpened. Spoons carved from wood. A new broom bound with twine. Hooks made from bone or iron. The work was not grand, not showy, but it was essential. It was how winter was survived, not only through endurance but through preparation. There was music sometimes, a flute made from hollow reed, a drum stretched with sheepskin, a single string plucked gently by the fire, not for performance, but for companionship. The sound filled the silence left by the sleeping fields. Stories were told too. While the wool spun and the cloth grew, voices shared tales of distant lands, of ancestors, of foxes that spoke in riddles, of a time when winter was so long, even the stars froze in place. Laughter came easily in these moments, not loud, but warm, a bubbling joy that lit the faces of the listeners like candlelight. The cat, half watching from the shadows near the fire, twitched its tail in approval. The spinning wheel never rushed. The loom never hurried. These crafts belonged to winter. Their pace was that of breath, of heartbeat, of slowly falling snow. And so the days passed, one thread, one stitch, one song at a time, while the world outside stayed quiet, covered in frost and waiting for the thaw. The peasants wove their lives from wool and wood and whispered stories. A different kind of harvest, a different kind of warmth, the kind that stayed long after the fire had burned low. At the centre of every village stood the church, not grand or gilded, but solid. Stone walls, rough and grey, rose just above the rooftops. Its steeple was short and square, topped with a simple wooden cross that leaned ever so slightly to one side. Moss grew between its stones, an ivy curled around its base, but it stood firm, always. It was the oldest building in the village, older than the manor, older even than most memories. Some said it had been built by the hands of saints. Others said it had simply always been there, rising from the earth like a tree. The church bells rang for mass, for marriage, for birth and for death. Their sound drifted over the fields, through the woods, and into the hearts of those who worked the land. It was not a loud sound, just steady, known, like breath. Inside, the air was cool and still. Candles lined the altar, their wax dripping slowly, silently, onto worn wood. The scent of incense lingered in the stones, faint and sweet, mixed with old smoke and damp. The priest was not a man of luxury. His robes were patched, his shoes soft with wear. He lived in a small room beside the chapel, warmed by a single fire and furnished with only a table, a stool, and a bed of straw. But his voice, when he read from the book, filled the whole space. The villagers gathered every Sunday, wrapped in cloaks, heads bowed. They did not understand every word. Latin was not their tongue, but the rhythm soothed them. The cymbals, the cross, the chalice, the flicker of flame were enough. The church was more than prayer. It marked time. The planting of barley began after the feast of St. Matthias. The sheep were shorn near Pentecost. The harvest followed Lammas. Life moved in circles drawn by saints and seasons. The church gave structure, purpose, hope. It gave fear too. The devil lived in stories, in crooked woods, in illness, in the howling of wolves at night. The priest warned of sin, of pride, of temptation. And the villagers listened, not because they did not know goodness, but because the world around them was wide and wild. The church offered a path through it. On feast days, the crossroads near the church came alive. Musicians played, dancers leapt. A maypole might rise in spring, its ribbons catching the sun. Bread was shared, honey, if there was any. Children ran barefoot through the grass, and old songs were sung as the stars emerged one by one. But always at the edge of the square, the church stood, watching, waiting, a quiet anchor. It was where babies were baptized in cold water, crying into candlelight, where couples whispered vows in soft voices, hands trembling, where the dead were laid to rest in silence, earth falling in slow handfuls onto wooden lids. The villagers passed through its doors again and again, from cradle to grave, their names recorded, their sins confessed, their prayers lifted. And through it all, the church endured. Simple, weather-worn, eternal, a place where the sky touched stone, and the voice of heaven was just quiet enough to hear. Beyond the edge of the fields, where the last furrows gave way to wild grass and the stone walls stopped following the paths, the woods began. Dense and quiet, they rose like a second world, one darker, older, and full of secrets. The villagers knew the edge of the forest well. It was where berries grew in late summer, where mushrooms sprouted after rain, and where children dared each other to peek past the first row of trees. But few went deeper, not without reason, not without silence. The forest was not forbidden, but it was watched. There were rules, known, never written. Only fallen branches were taken for firewood, never the standing trees. Herbs might be gathered, but never after sunset. If an animal was snared there, it was shared, not spoken of. It was not just the Lord's land. It belonged to older things. Some said spirits lived there. Not evil, just ancient. The kind that did not like to be seen. Lanterns that floated between trees. Footsteps in the underbrush with no one in sight. A voice calling a name that wasn't there. And yet, the woods were also a place of help. The healer walked there often, her basket on one arm, her cloak heavy with damp. She knew which moss to pick for wounds, which roots cured coughs, which flowers could ease pain or deepen sleep. She left small offerings when she took from the forest, a bit of bread, a pinch of salt, a whispered thanks. Others went too when they had no other choice. A man searching for a missing goat, a mother seeking quiet to grieve, a girl with questions no priest could answer. The forest did not offer comfort, but it listened. It did not reply, but it held secrets the way earth holds seeds, silently until the time is right. In winter, the woods stood still. Their branches, bare of leaves, reached toward the grey sky like blackened fingers. Snow clung to their bark. The only sound was the wind threading between trunks and the occasional flutter of a bird too stubborn to fly south. Even the animals seemed to walk more carefully. But in spring the woods woke. The air turned green again. Ferns unfurled. Streams bubbled in hidden hollows. The world grew fragrant, sweet, sharp, alive. And sometimes, if one stepped softly and did not speak, deer could be seen, or foxes, or a strange stone covered in moss, shaped like a face worn by centuries. The peasants respected the forest. They feared it. They needed it. They told stories about it, of children lost and returned with strange marks on their skin, of lights that led travelers safely home and lights that did not. At night, when the hearth was warm and the shutters drawn, the tales were told in low voices, not to frighten, to remember, to warn. The woods were not just a place of trees. They were a memory older than the village, a whisper older than the church, a shadow older than the Lord's banner. And though the peasants might never claim it, might never map it, the forest stood with them, watching, waiting. A part of the world that did not belong to anyone but held everyone just the same. The seasons turned, as they always did, slowly, inevitably. The frost receded, then returned. Rain fell and the fields drank. The sun climbed higher, then slipped away again. No one marked the days with calendars or clocks. Time was known by different signs. The snowdrops came first, shy and white beneath the hedgerows. Then the buds appeared on the trees. Lambs stumbled into the world on shaky legs. Birds returned to the thatch, weaving nests from straw and wool plucked from hedges. The wind changed its song. Children grew taller. Faces grew more lined. Old coats were patched one more time. New shoes were carved from old wood. Nothing stayed still. The peasants marked the years with what they had. A dent in the wall where a cradle once leaned. A scratch on the hearthstone from a pot dropped long ago. A new roof beam placed after the old one gave in to rot. The death of a hen. The birth of a son. A wedding. A silence. Weddings were quiet, simple things. A blessing at the church. A shared meal. A ribbon in the bride's hair. They did not wear rings. They wore promises, woven from shared chores, shared fields, shared winters. Babies came often, so did death. They lived close to each other. A baby might be baptized in the same church where a grandfather lay shrouded in the earth. The candles used for one were used again for the other. And still, the work went on. The first plough furrow was always made with care. The oxen pulled. The seed was cast. Hands pressed soil over each grain with a tenderness that might look like prayer. And in a way it was. Every planting was hope. The fields changed shape over time. Some became meadows. Others were claimed by trees. Paths shifted, worn by foot and wheel. The well deepened. The fences leaned. The sun fell in new places. Inside the cottages, items passed from hand to hand. A wooden bowl, darkened by decades of use. A shawl, worn and patched and still warming shoulders. A small carved figure placed near the fire, rubbed smooth by years of touch. The tavern stayed much the same. Its beams darker now, its door creakier. But the same stories were told there. The same jokes passed to the next mouth to tell them. The same corner by the fire, where the cat still slept. The ale was no stronger, but it was still shared. That was enough. Sometimes the world outside the village stirred. A rider passed through with news from the next town. A tax was raised. A soldier returned from war, older than he should have been. But these things felt far away, like storms seen on the horizon. They came and went, and still the wheat grew. Still the bread was baked. Still the wood was chopped and stacked by the door. And so time passed. Not in leaps, but in breaths. One sunrise at a time. One frost. One thaw. The peasants did not speak of the past often. They carried it instead, in their hands, in their work, in the shape of their days. In the hush of evening, as the fire dimmed and the walls caught the gold of its last glow, they closed their eyes and listened. To the wind, to the embers, to the quiet beat of time moving gently forward. The sun had begun its slow descent, casting long shadows across the fields. The sky, streaked with pale orange and soft lavender, lay stretched and silent above the thatched rooftops. A hush had fallen over the village, not from fear or sorrow, but from the soft closing of a long, simple day. Inside the cottages, the fires had been fed and tended. Their warmth settled into the stones, into the walls, into the bones of those who sat nearby. The day's labour was behind them now. The tools had been returned to their hooks. The animals fed, the last pot rinsed clean and placed beside the hearth. In one home, an old man sat with a woolen blanket draped over his shoulders. His eyes were closed, though he did not sleep. His hands rested in his lap, folded loosely. Around him, the air smelled of smoke and bread. A candle flickered gently on the table, its wax trailing slowly downward like a ribbon caught in still air. His daughter sat near the fire, spinning wool, though she paused now and then to watch him. Not out of worry, out of love. The kind that doesn't need words, the kind that's lived in bread, shared, roofs mended, wounds dressed. He had lived through many seasons, cold winters, full harvests, lean years, feast days. He had planted more seeds than he could count, held newborns, buried friends, watched storms pass through the woods. And now he rested, each breath a little slower, each moment a little longer. Elsewhere in the village, candles were being lit. Some homes used rushlights dipped in tallow. Others kept small oil lamps. Their glow spilled across tabletops and hearthstones, casting warm halos that shimmered with the draft of the evening wind. At the tavern, the benches were half filled. The talk was low, the laughter gentle. The fire crackled quietly. A woman hummed as she stirred a pot of soup. The cat slept on the bench near the door, paws tucked under, tail curled just so. The priest walked the path from the chapel, his lantern swinging lightly in his hand. He nodded to those he passed, offering a blessing with each glance. Not formal, not spoken aloud, just a presence, a reminder of peace. The woods beyond the fields stood quiet. The birds had fallen silent. The foxes had not yet begun their rounds. The trees, still bare, stood tall and still against the fading light. Mist coiled gently along the roots and hollows. Inside the cottages, beds were made up with straw and wool. Children yawned. Old stories were whispered one last time before sleep. A tale of a lost coin found beneath the hearth. A song about stars that sang. A memory that felt like a dream, and a dream that felt like a memory. And slowly, one by one, the lights were put out. The village dimmed. The wind passed gently over rooftops and through chimneys, as if tucking the village in. The last embers in the hearths glowed faintly. The night stretched soft and wide. And in that silence, in that calm, the peasants slept, not always safe, not always full, but tonight, warm, wrapped in wool and quiet, under a roof held together by time and care. And above them, the stars blinked slowly, patient and watchful, just as they always had. The village was still. Long before the sun reached the sky, before even the cocks had stirred in their roosts, the world lay in hush. A silver frost kissed the rooftops. The path through the center of the village was dark, but not empty. It held the breath of trees, the soft echo of wind against stone, the waiting. Inside one of the cottages, the first stirrings of life began. A woman rose from her bed. She moved slowly, quietly, wrapping a shawl around her shoulders and stepping near the hearth. Her breath curled in the air as she reached for the firewood. The embers from the night before were nearly gone, but not lost. She brushed aside the ash, added straw and thin twigs, then blew gently, the way her mother once taught her. The flame came back to life, a single orange curl. It crackled faintly, as if remembering something. One by one, other homes began to glow. A shutter opened. A door creaked. A cow lowed softly in a shed. The village began its waking not with noise, but with rhythm. The quiet sounds of morning, the soft thud of feet on packed earth, the rattle of a wooden pail, a murmur of prayer, a yawn, a sigh. In the chapel, the priest lit a single candle on the altar. Its flame danced in the stillness, throwing golden shapes onto the stone walls. He bowed his head, his voice a whisper, rising only enough to be heard by the rafters and whatever might be listening beyond. At the manor, a window caught the first light. The steward stirred. The cook began to knead dough in the cool kitchen, her hands red from the cold. But even there, above the fields, the morning came softly. The woods beyond the village shimmered with dew. A fox watched from the edge, its coat thick and ruddy. Birds shifted in their nests but did not yet sing. The trees stood in quiet agreement with the dawn. And in every home, one by one, the people began again. Boots were pulled on, bread was broken, water was fetched. Children stirred beneath blankets, rubbed their eyes and reached for warmth. Old hands lit lanterns, young hands reached for woolen cloaks. The fire caught stronger, brighter, and with it the world resumed. The tavern door creaked open. The innkeeper stepped out, rubbing his arms, watching the mist curl in the distance. He smiled at no one in particular, just the morning itself. Inside, the hearth still held warmth from the night before. A few benches had shifted, a few mugs left drying. Everything was just as it should be. Another day had begun, not loudly, not all at once, but with care, with quiet, with breath. And so the village lived, not in legend, not in glory, but in small things, in fields furrowed by hand, in bread made of patience, in songs whispered by firelight, in the hush of each morning. And though the world beyond the hills moved faster, and the years ahead would bring change, the heart of the village would beat on, slowly, steadily, softly, just as it always had.